Alrighty, so our second big topic for week 5 is objects. And objects are going to take a bit to completely, not completely, but even get a good introduction. So this is the intro. We'll end up doing objects later because we'll talk about how we use objects or how we use code to create objects. More along the lines of what's called OOP, object-oriented programming. But for this first part, we'll just learn some of the syntax, learn how to reference it, learn some of the benefits of it. So as kind of a meme in JavaScript, everything is an object. And so just keep that in mind, which is why learning objects is so important. You're going to see them again and again and again. So like before, I've given you a link to, working with objects in the guide, right? And objects are in all programming languages really, and they're similar in some ways and different in others, of course. Talk about creating new objects. I call it an object literal. Here it's called an initializer. Which is just creating new objects. So we're just going to create some for our code base, but definitely look through here and start getting some of the syntax you'll see. And then the idea of a constructor function is what I was referring to before, which is where we create new objects based on some kind of template. We're not going to do that for this round, but this is just an introduction to it. But it's good to know about it, good to read about it. Okay, so here we are. And now code along. So we're still in our week 5. So this is where I left my code. I still have the commented out, and that's the loop. And so at this point, what I'm going to do is add just some content for intro to objects. Okay, that way we can see in our code, because I'm somewhat tempted, and I've mentioned this before, to do some of this in the README file, but it makes more sense to put it in the JS file because we'll be practicing some code. So when we're creating, right, we've learned how. I'm just going to contrast here, right? My array equal, right? So we've learned about how to create arrays through array literals, and so now we're going to create objects. Okay, but it's different syntax. And it behaves differently, and it's referenced differently. Okay, so first what we can see here is that the difference to begin with is that it's block scoped. Okay, and that is good to understand because this is really about storing objects that have, and this is a concept you'll hear, which is a key and a value. Sorry, and that's my editor trying to help me. Not doing a great job. So what we create in an object is we create a key that stores a value, and then we can reference that key and value. Okay, now these are actually not, these are just, and I like that you start with these terms because, and they're also called properties. You can see when I roll over them, it can be any value, right? It's also called properties. You can hear this referred to in either way. Okay, so let's just, for our purposes, kind of start thinking about what kinds of data would we store in an object, right? And there's so many. It's really basically how we want to use these objects, but there would be some logical ways if I look through the code, and it would probably be somewhere in here where I have just pushed an array in creating that multi-dimensional array here. But these are just flat values, meaning, like let me go ahead and start up my live server so we can just remind ourselves as we're doing this work, right? When we were looking at, it doesn't like that code because it's not correct right now. We'll see that in a minute. So that's what it's throwing an error about right now. But if we were just to look at the data, right? When we look at each of those arrays inside of that array, there's not a lot we can tell except for the string array about what that data is. So by having a key and a value, it allows us then to be more descriptive, with the data, right? So we know that that last number is a total. So one of the ways we could do this, right, is if we set this object up here, and now these are not going to represent actual values yet, but we could do, there's different ways I've seen, I've done it different ways. Carbon footprint total would be a way, right? And then this would be hard coding a value into the object, okay? Typically, we would reference a value that already exists, but for this first part, I'm just, again, hard coding these concepts in here, okay? And so then I could talk about, right, house size. Now, in this case, right, this is an integer data. I could just put, right, string data as well. So notice a couple of things here. Of course, our open and close parentheses, our key, colon, and that's important, and then whatever that value is. And then there's a comma that separates each of the key value pairs. And if I only had two here, I wouldn't necessarily have to include the last one, okay? So I've created an object. How do I know? Based on the fact that I have these curly braces, this block scope. We've seen this block scope many times, but now we're actually using it to create an object itself. And so now what we could do is console.log, right, and just say my object. So let's go look at it in the console. Okay, it's actually above here. I think what I'm going to do, and I would recommend this as well, is this where I don't have all this output kind of getting in my way. Good. And then I would see only the last thing. So now what you can see here is this data structure, right, looks different and behaves differently than what we've seen in the past. And this is outputting, again, I could come over here and look at it, right? It's outputting just the object that I've created, the entire object. So there's the object, right? You can, I think, I'm trying to remember what that little I did, probably just informational. Yeah, this value is evaluated based on expanding. It may be changed since then. Yeah, so that's just an FYI. But in this case now, let's say I wanted to pull out one of the key value pairs. So this is where it starts talking about referencing. How do we reference? How do we pull out individual items? I'm going to scroll down a little further because this is still talking about how you create them. But this is talking about objects and their properties, because there's really two ways: the dot notation and the bracket notation. Okay. So you can kind of see, here's the object that was created, right? Here's the value. Now this is actually setting the value. So if we wanted to just see the value, let's come back here. We would say, right, this outputted the entire object. So if I wanted to say CFB total, okay, then that would then reach inside of this object, okay, pull the value for whatever that key was. So if I come back over here, now let me refresh that, okay. Oh yeah, so now, oh yeah, so I was like, where's my output? Well, because I changed this to just be the total, so that is what's happening on this line from 99. Took me a minute to go, where did the rest of it go? And again, if you ever wanted to look. Now the reason we can output it like here is this object right now is setting out on the global scope. If it was within, which would actually make more sense often to create these objects, right? We would probably create them, and in our case right here, when we're pushing, right, because we're going to change from using this structure of an array just to see the difference. That's actually going to be our next thing, okay? But let's just also look at how we would do this with the bracket notation, right? So going back here, right? So we can set the values in a similar way. We can also reference the values. This is still setting them, but we would use the same thing just to reference those or to view those. So in this case, if we wanted to say console.log, we'd say my object, okay, and then we'd use the brackets, and now we could use house size. By the way, they should both have this, okay. It's only, again, and remember the syntax, right? Key values, commas between, open and close parentheses. So now if I come over here, then I get that output of that string so that my object can contain, kind of like arrays, any type of data that I choose to, okay? Which is really, really helpful, okay? Now, when you first see this, you might think, well, what's the benefit of this? And there's so many benefits, mostly because a lot of the things that are built into JavaScript are based on this idea of an object. And so you'll often see, and this will be something we get introduced to, something called methods, because we can write functions inside. So if I wanted to do function, okay, so a function can be a part of the object itself, okay? Let's say print, let's just say output, okay? And then I could do that. Let's see, what am I missing there? I'm missing something. Hold on just a second. I had it close. So in this case, display out. Now all I'm doing is defining a property here. And I'm just going to say out, and then I do the colon. Okay. So the syntax is very similar to what we've seen before, except in the sense of the function itself. Okay. So then we can say console.log, right? And this would be key. This is a method call. All right. Now, first time you see this, it'd be like, why in the heck would you put a function inside of an object? Well, for one thing, it encapsulates it. It allows us to have functions that are scoped inside of the object. We can also then reference the keys and the values inside the object with a term that is often confused, but I'll show you that in a minute. But for now, let's actually just do this. Let's call. Now, how would we, right, call this object? Well, because it is going to output console log itself, I would say my object dot display out. Okay, so I'm referencing the object that I've created. I'm doing dot notation to reference the function, and by doing the open and close parentheses, I'm actually calling the function. So let's see this in action. Okay, right, so this is a method call. So not only can objects store data structures, they are a data structure in and of themselves, like arrays are a way to store data. But in addition to storing key value pairs, and again, the thing that gets added on an object is we can then give a key so that when we're storing data, it tells us a bit more. So it's creating a variable that represents that data, unlike an array. So it gives us more flexibility in the way that and more information. Okay. Now, where this can be a bit confusing the first time you've seen it, is you can also do something like, and let's just do this. Now, this is a command in JavaScript and in many other languages that references the object. Okay. So let's see this in action. Okay, so if I come over here, kind of before where I output it, you know, I just console logged out the object. Now when I call this, or when I say console log this, I'm referring to the object, what's inside of it. Okay. Now I can still reference it externally from inside, but you're going to see the reference to this over and over again for various reasons. Okay, so the sooner, and here's what I mean. I could still here, right? I could say my object, so I kind of do the external reference dot here. I could still do this, and it will still output it. But from really what we want to do in JavaScript is we want to start using the this inside of an object. Again, it's referencing back to what's inside. Now, there'll be times when and actually in modern JavaScript, sometimes we're having a discussion about walking away or moving away from using the this, because just talking about this can get confusing. But let me just show you here to where I could reference, let's say, house size. So I would say this, reference the object, right? Dot house size to, instead of doing the external reference, I would do an internal reference using the this, and then I would get small, right? I was trying to remember. Oh yeah, I was trying to remember. Actually, that where it gets a little confusing, I'd get rid of those just so I could see. Right, so I do the method call to display out, which then outputs this house size. Hopefully you see the challenge with that. Okay, so that's your introduction. So I'm going to go ahead and have you commit, because the next one's going to be a code challenge. I'm going to have you, and actually I'll set this up in the next one. So I'll go ahead and have you commit this code, and then I'll go over the code challenge I want you to try. Okay?